Making time to join us here tonight or this afternoon, wherever you're dialing in from. I'm really, really excited to be joining you all here as the new head of chapter for New York City, the Products That Count team. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my predecessor in this role, Brian Root. He's got a really exciting discussion for you here tonight, or what I hope will become a discussion. We're looking forward to fielding any questions that you all have throughout the webinar this evening. But I know Brian's a familiar face to a lot of you, so I'll get out of the way, and Brian, I'll let you introduce yourself here and kick off your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Glad to hand off the baton to you. Let me share my screen real quick. All right. So topic for tonight, I've prepared and hopefully we'll discuss with everybody, synergy by design, how to build cross-functional teams in product management, design, and UX research. So hopefully this works. There we go. Quick agenda. I'll do a quick introduction to myself. Won't spend too much time there. I do want to spend the bulk of this time talking about what cross-functional teams look like and what it's like to work on them. And then we'll close with a brief discussion of what it's like to build and lead cross-functional teams specifically. So brief personal history. The way I've thought about my career and its progression has largely followed the path that many product leaders take, which is that you start at the bottom of the pyramid showed here, you learn how to build products. That's how you effectively do the job of product management. And then you take on people management responsibility, learn how to develop people into good product managers, moving one step up the pyramid. And then you continue to move up, you assume responsibility for one or more departments or functions, and the development of that function to a high-performing team becomes effectively the product that you are managing. And then finally, you may reach a stage where you're lucky enough to be able to manage across functions at a company level, and so you're thinking about functions and company as your product. So my path was a little bit inverted, in that I actually learned how to manage people first in a non-product role. And then I came into my first product management role as a people manager. So I do think that I tend to come at product problems from a very people-centric perspective. Whether or not that influences what I'm going to share with you today is, of course, up for you to debate and decide. But over time, I've been able to work my way up the pyramid, as you can see on the left, to take on leading product management, product design, and UX research as functions. And then I'm hoping someday to make it to the top of the pyramid. So see what the future holds. And I think because I started from a place of thinking about how people form teams, I've also kind of then naturally become very curious about how to think about how teams form functions and how functions form companies. And so I'm really excited to share some of my thoughts with you about that subject and talk about cross-functional teams. But first, a preamble. So why am I talking about product management, product design, and UX research? It's easy, simple answer is those are the functions I managed. That's not a great answer, though. I'll give you a better one. In my experience, product design and UX research are often viewed as functions in service of product management, or in some cases engineering, or in some cases of marketing, or many other functions depending on your company. That is, product manager is kind of in charge of everything, and product design and UX research are in some cases even reporting to, and in most other cases dependent on product managers to determine what they work on. I don't think this is necessarily the right way of working. It does create some counterproductive dynamics. So let's talk a little bit about why that can be the case. So first, I think there's a lot of familiarity bias at play. I think you can observe a lot about the maturity and perception of a role from kind of who it reports into at both early and late stage companies. And what you see at a lot of companies is that early on, product design will be led by a head of product management, and then at later stages, the functions will again get lumped into reporting into a chief product officer equivalent. This isn't always the case, of course. Some companies do have independent design and research teams that don't report into the CPO, but I've really never seen the opposite, companies at which product management is reporting to someone who came up through only product design or only research. So across tech, broadly speaking, we have functions at all stages of company growth being managed by people who never did the function themselves. So it's unfortunate, but it's only natural for those managers to bias towards what they already know, even if it's unconsciously. Second, there's a lot of inconsistency across tech around naming conventions and expectations for these roles. I think this is something that broadly folks are probably very familiar with if you're reading articles in the community. So I won't go too deep into that, but some of the things you commonly hear are, product manager is CEO of the product or product owner. That's really a different thing entirely. Product designer is, a product manager who can use Figma. I just saw that one on LinkedIn 2 days ago, and then I have to say it was a very popular post, which kind of bothered me a little bit. And sometimes you see, UX research is just talking to people. It's not that hard, right? I think all of those things are incorrect, and topics we'll touch on a little bit throughout the talk as well. And the third thing I think is that there is another significant factor here, which is that much of the work these roles do is invisible in the sense that they're complex processes, which the output is kind of the simplest possible thing, right? It takes a lot of time, thought, and effort to make it simple to understand what our customers need, to make it as simple as possible for customers to use that, find the simplest possible solution to the problem. And if you're only looking at the output of those processes, it can be very hard to understand why something that's so simple takes so much time or requires so many people. Right? So this can be deeply uncomfortable for a lot of companies and leaders to understand and embrace if they haven't actually done the work themselves. So my perspective on this is that it's much more effective to talk about the role each of these functions should serve within the product development process and less about the skills, tools, and artifacts of each function. Because if you're talking about the latter, it's too easy to fall into the trap of arguing about how simple those skills are or how much overlap there is between a product manager and a product designer, for example. So there's a very simple framework that I'd like to introduce here that'll also be critical to some of our later discussion about cross-functional team dynamics. And just to be clear, I am blatantly stealing this from an article that Marty Kagan wrote in 2017, but I have yet to see anything that makes more sense to me personally. So this framework hinges on looking at product development process from the perspective of various risks that must be understood and mitigated in order to ensure that the product has value for both users and the company. So from left to right, we have value risk, or is this something that our customers will use? Usability risk, or is this something that our customers can use? Feasibility risk, or is this something that we can build with the technology and resources that we have? And finally, business viability risk, or is this a solution that works for all aspects of our business? And if we look at it from this perspective of risk, the critical question becomes, do we have people who are experts in identifying and solving for these risks in each of these areas? And then I think it becomes a lot simpler to advocate for each of these roles associated with those risks once it's clear that they're focusing on different parts of the problem, even if in some cases using common skills to do so. So that's all context. Let's talk about working on cross-functional teams. So we'll start with some common team structures. So the first one I want to talk about is the siloed team structure. You tend to find this a lot in enterprise tech and tech-enabled companies, since it mirrors the segmentation that you tend to find in most other job functions at those companies. In this team structure, you have product management, design, and research operating as completely different teams with different leadership structures. And in most companies, again, not always the case, but you tend to have a lot more PMs than designers and a lot more designers than researchers. And what tends to happen at these companies is that design and research function as kind of internal agencies that operate downstream of product management. I realize I've reversed this in the picture and made them upstream. Apologize. But sometimes other parts of the business are determining strategic priorities, are also determining the work that goes into design and research. But the real critical dynamic is design and research are not typically part of that strategic conversation. And rather, they generally have to wait to be told kind of what they should be working on. Because this is effectively an agency model, there's very little continuity in the relationship of people and initiatives over time. So, sorry, having a slide issue. There we go. So I want to go a little bit deeper here. Point out there's a really tangible impact on this way of working, which is that it leads to a lot of inefficiency as people are constantly needing to be brought up to speed on the what and the why of each request. So if you think about each of these bars that I've showed here as an individual request or unit of work, and you tend to have a large pool of PMs in this model generating work. So even if every PM individually is slow, in aggregate, the pace at which a new piece of work is generated is pretty fast. And because long-term relationships between PMs and the other functions aren't solidified, those pieces of work go to a general pool to figure out who can work on them. So every request or document that needs to be discussed, debated, some are deemed not ready to be worked on and get sent back and they have to be reworked. And you're really spending a lot of time in this model having new conversations about conversations that already happened. So there's a significant opportunity cost for product designers within this way of working. And you can see represented here that product design almost by definition works behind product management, right? If you kind of track the colors, that's how I've represented it, right? You need the product management work to be complete before the equivalent product design work can be picked up. It's slower, they're working also slower than product management because there's time required to get both the context for the work and then to do the work itself, right? And additionally, there are some missed opportunities here when work is not ready to be picked up or gets deprioritized or reprioritized, as I said. Similarly, UX researchers in this structure are often brought onto a track of work after it's already been well-defined by a product manager or someone else in the business. And because they have the support of an experienced set of UX research who should understand how the UX research process works, they are often given leeway to conduct excellent research and can deliver excellent and valuable insights. But those insights often get delivered well after the product managers and designers have completed their work. So insights tend to be relegated to helping improve version 2 of the product or a fast follow. And any insights that didn't support building the product in the first place, frankly, tend to get ignored. So we're losing a lot of the value that UX research could and should be providing to mitigate value risk upfront here. It's all coming after the fact. So let's talk about the dynamics the structure and way of working often creates. Most interactions between roles in teams structured this way are fairly transactional, and there's a lot of tension around timelines and deliverables. So it's very easy for people to fail to make close connections with each other and instead view them as part of the problem or other functions that don't really get it. Second, start to develop the perception of UX research and product design as events rather than processes, right? So the product manager has finished writing the product specs. Now it's time to hand off that document to the product designer so they can deliver the designs. And this completely ignores the reality that high quality design work requires a deep understanding of who your customer is, how they interact across their journey with both your products and services and those of other companies. And it's really quite challenging to understand how a very specific request coming from product management or somewhere else can fit into that ecosystem when you're expected to turn around the designs also on a very short timeline. And third, because again, if they're rarely, if ever, involved in the strategic conversations, research and design start to lose a concrete understanding of where the business is strategically headed and practically speaking, how it can make money. So I don't want this to sound all doom and gloom though. Most companies don't have all the issues I'm describing, and there are things that you can do certainly to help improve those dynamics. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. I did want to just suggest one thing for each role that I recommend you do, if it can at all relate to the siloed team dynamic that I've been describing. So for product managers, I advise you to proactively provide as much context as possible to your designers and researchers as frequently as possible, right? Don't wait to be done with product specs to get them involved in the conversation. Do them a favor, let them start thinking about and contributing to solving the problem as soon as possible. For product designers, I'd say constantly obsess about the customer's journey and your product's role throughout it. The less you have to start from scratch thinking about every request, the more you can just take that request and slot it into the correct context within the customer's journey, faster and the higher quality output is going to be. For UX researchers, say you really have to find a way to kick down the door and force your way into the strategic conversations, even if it's purely as a fly on the wall. You're simply not going to be able to do your job well if you're constantly reacting rather than skating to where the puck is going to be. So I hope these small pieces of advice are at least a little bit helpful for some folks. Let's talk about our next team structure. So the embedded team structure. You're going to find this more often in your Series B, C, D growth stage companies. And this often takes the form of product squads with one or more product managers, usually one, sometimes more product designers, and usually a shared UX researcher if you're lucky enough to have one. There's usually no distinct head of research or design within this structure. All of these squads tend to operate independently and collectively report into a unified head of product management. Sometimes even within the squads, the designers and researcher may report into the lead product manager. So here on the upside, you have the benefit of long-term focus on specific product areas and the creation of long-term relationships between cross-functional individuals vis-a-vis the product squad, which is by and large great. But of course, there are some also more detrimental dynamics that can also arise. So because areas of ownership and relationships are more defined within this structure, there naturally tends to be fewer product managers capable of generating work for any given designer or researcher. And the variability of the work therefore decreases a bit. That's not a bad thing. Product designers are still often dependent on their work being defined by the product manager, but the relationship in the context of the work remains the same for longer periods of time. So it is generally possible for the designer to understand and deliver on that work efficiently. And where things tend to break down a little bit more within this model is at the researcher stage. Because they're spread so thin across squads, those squads often have very distinctly different areas of focus, very challenging for the researcher to develop into their full process to deliver value. So a natural reaction is to try to do a little bit for everyone and cut down the process and cut corners, at which point you're really only getting fractional value from the role. Compounding that, you don't have the benefit of a high-level research leader in this structure with the functional expertise necessary to advocate for you, get the space that you need to do your job really well. So it becomes a very reactive model. So let's talk about some of the other dynamics on the embedded team. I'm not sure whether it's correlation or causation, but I have found my experience the PM often operates in this structure as the unofficial leader of the team, who kind of tells the other functions what to work on. I think there's two reasons for this. One, because there isn't a higher research or design authority, if you will, to appeal to, but there is a higher product management authority in the head of product. And two, because as I previously mentioned, that head of product for these teams is so often someone who has only ever done the product management function previously, and therefore likely has familiarity bias with the role as mentioned. Second, it's not uncommon for researchers and designers to struggle with improving their skills and finding ways to move up the company within the structure, because other than their peers, there often simply aren't other higher level folks with enough research and design experience to know what good looks like and to help them advance. And finally, as already mentioned, UX research often gets marginalized because it's very difficult to justify staffing a full-time researcher for a product squad. And it's also very difficult for the UX researcher to operate across product squads in a fractional capacity. So again, one thing to do if you're any of those roles on an embedded team. As a product manager, I would say stop delegating tasks to your researcher and designers and start looking at them as thought partners with critical strategic input. And granted, giving up on that control can be hard. But I really promise you, if you have competent cross-functional peers, which I certainly hope everyone does, inviting them into the process will yield you a much better result. As a product designer, hopefully this doesn't sound too flip, but I would say find a mentor or someone who can help you get better at your craft, because that's unlikely to come from your peers or manager in this structure. It can be really fun and exciting to experience the growth at earlier stage companies that tend to have this structure, but you also need to really think about advancing your skills along with the company. As a UX researcher, you're kind of playing the long game here. Rather than trying to help everyone, I think you'll be much better served by delivering huge, significant impact for one team in one area, and then using the momentum of that success to advocate for hiring more researchers who can continue to operate with singular focus to support the other teams. All right, the last team structure I want to talk about is the round table. And I would say the round table is a very similar idea to democracy in several ways, not least that all team structures are bad, but the round table is the least bad that I am aware of. And what I think is particularly interesting about this one is that it really toes the line between org structure and philosophical approach. And because of that, hopefully it's something that everybody can take at least some piece of and implement for your team and company, regardless of what your reporting structure looks like. So let's look at the structure here. This will generally take the form of UX research, product design, and product management, all on separate teams, reporting to different functional leaders, who will then all report into the same top-level leader, who is likely, depending on stage, either, again, a head of product at a smaller company, or potentially chief product officer at a larger company. Now, you're probably looking at this and saying, oh, this looks darn similar to the siloed team structure that I had up before. And in terms of the org chart, it really is. There's nothing round and nothing tabular about this at this stage. This concept of the round table really comes into play when you think about how you're structuring your team, not on the org chart, but really in the real world. Starts with setting the table with place cards, if you will. This is a metaphor, clearly, for all the types of risk that you need to mitigate depending on what you're building. And we can start with the 4 types of risk we previously talked about, but you also really need to be mindful of risks that are mitigated by other functions within your company. For example, activation risk, which may be the responsibility of your product marketing team to mitigate, or financial or legal or any other type of risk that's relevant. The next step is to find the right people to be at the table and part of the conversation to consistently ensure that each risk is being mitigated throughout the product development process, right? So, for example, early in a track of work where there's significant ambiguity, it might be most valuable to have the director of UX research involved and have that seat at the table. Later on, as the track of work becomes more defined, might be more appropriate for a more junior UX researcher to take that seat. But that should really occur intentionally and must ensure that the relevant context is handed off from one to the other anytime that seat is changing. Less ideally, in some cases, if you don't have an expert available, the seat can be filled by somebody else. And I think the key point here is that the risk itself does not go away just because there isn't somebody who's, really perfectly designated to think about it, right? You must have somebody who's accountable for thinking about it. Anybody thinking about mitigating that risk is better than nobody. I would also say it's very important to view this structure as fairly permanent. This works best when all parties are consistently present at the table. That doesn't literally mean that everybody has to be at every meeting. That would be overkill. But it does mean that, they do need to be present and part of the conversation leading up to and part of making any critical decision. One thing to be very mindful of is that having a seat at the table does not mean that you're in charge, and it does not mean that you're always talking. It simply means that you're part of the conversation, right? You have the opportunity, not necessarily obligation even, to ask questions, to raise concerns, to suggest ideas. So why do I say this is the least bad of all the structures? I think fundamentally because it does a pretty decent job of accounting for the deficiencies of the other structures that we just talked about, right? We are forming long-term relationships between both individuals and teams by dint of having each one have a clear and defined seat at the table, which enables trust and rapid communication as that dynamic develops. Within that physical org structure, all functions have role-appropriate leadership and career pathing, so everyone has the opportunity to up-level their skills and advance in a very appropriate way. And then the third major benefit is that because you have a seat at the table within this structure for roles that extend beyond product, beyond design, beyond research, and in fact, beyond tech, you get increased accountability and engagement from stakeholders throughout the process. So let's finally take a look at the idealized workflow for the roundtable team. The interesting thing here is that I would argue UX research starts to ideally become a starting point in the product development process rather than a parallel or condensed step. So if you can identify the core customer problem to be solved, then once we have a rock solid understanding of that, we can quickly move into the other types of risk, find potential solutions that work for the business. And since product design has been part of that conversation from the beginning and already has full strategic context for the work, they can get started sooner and rather than being completely dependent. And so ideally, you can see that work gets done in a much more coordinated, consistent way within this roundtable structure. All right, so we've been talking about cross-functional team structures, what it's like to work on them. Let's wrap up with a few minutes talking specifically about leading cross-functional teams. So what I've put together here are a list of what I believe to be imperatives for someone who is in the position of leading a cross-functional team. And I think the first one, whether you choose to adopt the roundtable model or not, is to create space at that virtual table and keep those seats filled at all times. I think there's permanent benefit to involving your stakeholders and to making it very clear what role you want everyone to play at which stage in the process, regardless of what your work structure looks like, regardless of how else you choose to run your team. Second, because you don't want chaos, your imperative is to make it clear what is needed from each seat, each role, each person, regardless of how you look at it, during each phase of that product development process, right? Broadly speaking, that can look like, sometimes you want a certain role to listen. Sometimes you want them to participate in the conversation. Sometimes you want them to lead that conversation. At the end of the day, you don't want everyone talking at once. You also don't want groupthink, right? Your job is to strike a balance to ensure that everyone has a chance to participate. But critical decisions are weighted heavily towards the expertise of the role and of the people accountable and capable of mitigating that risk. Third, your imperative is to drive conversation and collaboration. I think the worst thing that can happen is for people to go back to operating in silos or being completely dependent on each other for work, right? You need that collaboration to happen up front so that everybody knows how they can move forward and have that context for the decisions and the conversation that was had previously. And the final one I would say, this is fairly obvious probably, but a big part of your job is to coordinate the work in progress, but also to plan ahead, right? In most of the scenarios that we looked at, UX research is going to be your long pole, right? They're going to take much longer than any other function to get high quality work done, not because they're any worse, simply because it's a different process that they're going through. So really use UX research, if at all possible, as your measuring stick, and try to be at least one cycle ahead of the cadence that they're working on. Additional considerations here, not necessarily imperatives, but things to keep in mind. First, I would say hire functional leads if possible. If you can hire functional leads with the right expertise, you will benefit from it and your team will benefit from it. If you can't, for any reason, maybe you're a smaller company, you don't have that count, whatever it is, at least keep in mind that you probably suck at managing whichever functions that you're managing that you haven't previously done yourself. That may not, in fact, be true. You may be wonderful at them. I don't know you, but it's a safe starting point at least. I will say, in my experience, some of the most counterproductive leaders that I've worked for were ones who were in charge of cross-functional teams while only ever having done one of the functions themselves, and who seemed to be really unaware of their biases. But I would say the good news, also in my experience, is that often just being aware of and open about your expertise or lack thereof in a certain area is sufficient. I have repeatedly found that a lot of really bright and really talented people are willing to jump into roles which require them to be fairly independent within their function, as long as they're given the space to leverage their expertise appropriately. But you're really not going to hire and retain great, high quality people by demonstrating to them that you don't understand their job while telling them how to do it. And last, I'm not going to get too into the weeds of, PMs are like this and product designers are like that or whatever, but the reality is that if you have a cross-functional team, you almost certainly now have a very diverse set of personalities and preferences on your team. And again, I think one of the biggest traps I've seen and experienced myself is leaders who believe that everyone, regardless of role, regardless of skill set, should behave or communicate in a certain way. And you really need to make an effort to meet people where they are and create an inclusive environment that allows all of your functions to thrive. And that's definitely not a monoculture. In fact, it may mean creating distinct but connected cultures by team or by function. And that brings me to the end already. Wanted to leave with some things that some books that I've found helpful, both to my thinking and also to contributing to this talk as well. I won't go through these, just leave these on the screen. Obviously, folks can come back to the recording, but highly recommend all of these reads, even if some of them are very esoteric and dry. If you have as much interest in this subject as I do, you'll find them very valuable. But that is my presentation. Thank you for the time, and I am happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brian. That's really fantastic stuff. Really keen to receive and address any questions that everybody in the audience has. I'll just mention a lot of what you talked about today resonates. I forgot to mention in my introduction of myself today that I work at a company called Intap. We build software for large enterprise law firms, financial services firms, accounting, consulting. So very, very deep in the enterprise B2B space. And as I'm sure a lot of folks who work in B2B, be it for, enterprise, SMB, up and down the food chain, I'm sure we're all hearing more and more about the consumerization, quote unquote, of tech for other businesses, right? Where folks are now taking the expectations around the UX and the design that they see in consumer applications and projecting those onto their business applications, which makes sense as folks become more tech literate. They want to use similarly friendly technology at work as they do in their personal lives. So I think that's putting a lot of pressure on this style of organization as more and more companies are realizing they need to adopt UX and UI best practices. I know it's been a journey for us at Intap. It's one that we're still on. And I think, I see us nudging towards more of that roundtable methodology, but maybe still fighting against the tide of some of the other ones. Something that comes up as we're working and as I see product managers working through individual enhancements or new features that they're trying to deliver is just some of what you pointed to at the end there, but managing the timeline, right? I've got to get something out. I've got a commitment that I need to hit, or I'm just trying to keep my roadmap on track. But now I've got to account for all of the work that the UX research team wants to do and the work that the design team wants to do, and just the bandwidth those new stakeholders require. Do you have any recommendations for PMs? I know obviously just trying to budget that time is helpful, but even within the time that you've budgeted, do you have any recommendations for how to, account for this additional work that should go into features?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of two paths to go down there in parallel in my mind. One is, as I think I at least hinted at in the presentation, I think it's really a requirement in that model to deeply understand what does it take for a product designer or a UX researcher to actually deliver high quality input or output, depending on how you want to think about it, to the product at hand. That I think is necessary because as a product manager, right, you are inherently on the hook for the success of that product still, within most of these structures, right? I think arguably it is in your best interest to understand how to get the most and the best, output from, the other functions that are working on that product with you. So if you look at it kind of as if you're, cutting their time short or not giving them full information or context or whatever, and that's really hurting your own ability to deliver on your responsibilities, then I think it becomes very important to really understand that. Once you understand that, you can really start to build that into the promises you're making, right? It's not, I'm done with my part, and then, let me go check with the product designer how long it's going to take for them to get theirs done. You can start to proactively message this process end to end, of which we're collectively responsible, takes X amount of time. My part is Y, and this other part is Z, and we're now at the stage where we are transitioning or whatever, working between Y and Z. But owning that entire process, I think, is part of the answer there, not just saying, I did my part and now it's their part, right? The other, I think, is to start to really run that up the chain of whoever is in charge of your product function, again, whether that's CPO, the business, whatever it may be. I think a large part of this dynamic comes from a lack of context or a lack of understanding of how products truly get built, right? It's very tempting to just look at, a document gets written, some picture gets made, the engineer turns that picture into a website, and we're done. But I think the more that you can actually engage the people who are driving these strategic decisions and putting pressure on those timelines with an understanding of how do you actually get a really high quality output out of that? And it's not just, copy Google's design system and, slap something together. I think that'll take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of people collectively kind of chipping away at understanding. But I do think that needs to be undertaken as well, because frankly, we need people at the highest levels who really deeply understand this process if we're going to start to get it right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, that's part of this industry-wide shift again, especially in B2B, towards embracing design as more of a fundamental part of the product delivery process. But I think you're right. I mean, a lot of it does come down to a cultural adjustment and being comfortable and allowing those extra beats for something to come to fruition in order for it to look and feel as if it's of higher quality. I think another thing in my experience that comes up, and you sort of alluded to it as well, is just as now product is interacting with UX research and interacting with designers at a deeper level, you can have competing priorities, in some cases, competing visions for a feature. How do you suggest, or do you have any pointers for folks as to how to handle some of that intra-team competition?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would look at that as the competition in the sense of it's a scrimmage, right? We're all on the same team. We're probably just trying to sharpen our skills against each other, right? I think there's a couple ways to handle that depending on the situation, right? In the ideal case where we have unlimited time and resources, I would say the best way to probably proceed is to do a test of some sort, right? If there's two different ideas and we can't, see to eye on which one is correct, the users of your product should be the ones who can ultimately give you that direction. Obviously, that's not always the case, right? We can't run a test for everything. We can't necessarily accurately test some things that are, very, very complicated. I think in those cases, some sort of, I would think about it as kind of arbitration process is not necessarily the best way to go, but I think certainly better than kind of just making a call, right? I think my thought, and going back again to a very, people first leader, is if there's an argument on the team, I want both people to feel heard, understood, and know the reason for moving forward on a certain decision, right? So that does not, to me, look like me just saying, what's your argument? What's your argument? Okay, we're doing that one, right? I think we need to have a collective conversation and really, try to treat that as almost a product in itself, right? Dig down into the whys of why do you feel that way? What are you hinging that on? What's the experience that you have that, makes you tend to lean in one direction versus another? And I think through the process of that conversation, you can probably find more alignment than you initially thought. That's been my experience, right? A lot of the time people are not necessarily disagreeing because one person's idea is good and the other is bad, or, they are wildly off on how they're perceiving something. It's usually because there's a missing piece of context, or frankly, maybe there are feelings involved in some cases, right? But it's not usually something that is purely factually based. So I think if you can dig down past that kind of surface layer of what are the facts that people are saying to what else is going on underneath the surface, that can often drive a lot of alignment.
Yep, agreed. And I think just hearing you talk through some of those strategies, they resonate with a lot of strategies I know we all talk about with how to interact with our counterparts on the engineering team as well, who are obviously a core stakeholder in all of this. It brings up a question for me, just thinking about that roundtable approach, which I agree there's a ton of benefit when we can lead with customer value, we can lead with the UX research. I know a lot of PMs might be familiar with a world where they lead with an idea and maybe first discuss it with a lead or a counterpart on the engineering side. So how would you recommend PM seek to incorporate engineering in that roundtable approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good call out. Certainly, I would say bare minimum engineering is a very critical seat at that table, right? They are mitigating an enormous risk for any business, which is, I can think of any idea I want to, and if we can't actually build it, it's worthless, right? So you need them there to give you that that guidance consistently of, is this actually possible with what we have? I think the one challenge I've seen with engineers at certain times has been the willingness to be involved in those conversations, particularly at very early stages before any sort of, excuse me, before any sort of technical detail is actually being discussed, can vary wildly from engineer to engineer, right? So I think that's a perfect case of where I would say finding the right person for the stage of conversation that you're in is really important, right? That may mean that you're starting with a very high level or a principal engineer, the kind of the very ambiguous early stages of the conversation to give you, some high level technical direction. And then once you really start to get to the nitty gritty details, then you're bringing in kind of your line level engineers. But it may very well be the case that you have someone on your team who's at a lower level who loves to be part of those conversations. I've certainly met those people as well. I think it's a little bit one of the roles that you have to feel out more so than the others in my experience.
Yeah, I think that resonates. And then I've got one more question. Of course, again, we're happy to field anything else from the group. But just one more that comes to mind for me. So again, thinking about the round table illustration that you provided and the different sort of categories of risk that need to be mitigated, I think that's really, really informative. I'm trying to put myself in shoes that I've inhabited in the past, and that I imagine others on the call are in today, where maybe you're at a very early stage business working on finding product market fit, or maybe you're soon post fit and working on rapidly iterating on product to drive broader adoption. How do you suggest folks evaluate who to pull in to fill some of those risk areas, or attempt to fill more than one themselves when they might not have dedicated individuals?
Yeah, I mean, first thing I'll say is it's hard, right? It requires a lot of intention. It's not necessarily in most people's nature to sit there and say, I'm going to consider a problem from one angle and then intentionally take a step back, consider it from a very different angle, right? We kind of tend to think how we think a lot of the time, right? So you have to have that intentionality of, I need to check all of these boxes of risk and make sure that I've thought about them as much as possible in isolation first, and then how they kind of weave together. So I think if you're in a position where you have to, to play multiple roles, to wear multiple hats at that table, create whatever structure you need to facilitate that intentionality, right? Whether that's literally a checklist, or put time on your calendar for an hour block to say, today I'm thinking about value risk, tomorrow I'm thinking about usability risk, whatever it is. But anything that gets you to that point of intentionality. And I think similarly for finding the right people throughout your company, I would say to me that probably just takes the form of a series of conversations, right? You probably, through just natural interactions with the people, have at least a short list. You can mentally say, of these are the people who could probably help me with, value risk, whichever one it may be. Let me go have a conversation with them to just say, I'm thinking about that with respect to this product, our customers actually going to use this. Let's talk through that, right? And maybe you're cobbling together, 4 people's perspectives into sitting at that seat, or maybe you find one person who's really able to give you that, kind of expert or close to expert insight into it. As I said on one of the slides, I think the key here is at least have somebody thinking about it, right? Even if you're doing a really bad job at it, it's probably still better than nobody thinking about that area of risk. So just do your best to find somebody who can at least devote that time to it.
I think that's a really good note to end on, especially in light of some of the slides that you had, where, again, as a PM, you might be a little bit ahead of the bandwidth of your design or UX research counterparts. If you can find somebody else to cover that value risk or that usability risk, maybe somebody with a particular level of expertise from the sales or leadership team, or somebody who works closely with clients in a services or account management capacity, they might be able to opine and give you some of that direction where you don't have it from a dedicated resource. This is all really good stuff, Brian. I really appreciate you sharing this with us today. And of course, we thank you for everything you've done for products that count over the years. hope to see you around on future webinars, future events. Maybe have you back as a future guest.
Yeah, it would be my pleasure. Thank you. It's been definitely a thrill to be on the other side of the table for the first time, and hopefully we'll get the opportunity to do it again. And thank you also to everyone in the audience and everyone who watches this after the fact.
Awesome. Good stuff. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap things up. But thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.